uncomfortable question to ask you. You said, porn has no place in a man's life, so I'd like to know why you feel so strongly about that statement.
This is a hill I'm willing to die on, and I've seen the plethora of men cling to their porn like it's the last thing they have on earth. The right person will be attracted to the right traits. I was so lost in the sauce that I was living two lives at one point. If we could pivot back into porn real quick, I wanted to hit on something.
Smut books?
No, not smut books. We'll get to that.
Okay.
If I could go back in time and tell myself one thing, I'd be like, man, just don't quit. Keep going, because life rips at the end of this. Unique New York. The arsonist has oddly shaped feet.
Who?
Welcome, y'all. So today we're going to talk about some really polarizing stuff, some very important stuff, I think, for both men and women. Some stuff you might not want to hear, some stuff you probably need to hear, and take what lands, discard what doesn't, as always. Crack open a Celsius.
Ka-chow. Maverick. We went on a walk earlier today, and you said, porn has no place in a man's life. So I'd like to know why you feel so strongly about that statement, because it was pretty convicted.
I'm going to check the mic real quick. Hold on.
Still figuring out this tech shit.
All right, say that again.
Maverick.
Baby.
Maverick.
Baby.
Caitlin. Porn has no place in a man's life. You said that to me audaciously, convicted, on our walk today. Why do you feel so strongly about that?
Porn has no place in a man's life who wants fulfillment, stability, purpose, and solidity in who you are, intimacy, honesty, the best sex you've ever had, nourishing interactions with your partner, presence in the moment, and focus. I speak from both lived experience, and there's also a ton of data on how pornography impacts the brain. We can get into that a little bit more later on, but I've lived a life where I was totally down the rabbit hole of the progressive distraction, the progressive nature of pornography, how the system preys on people, and you get into an algorithm where it's very similar to YouTube or any other platform, where it starts to suggest more and more content, and usually with pornography the content is more extreme. And I've also experienced the lack of sovereignty with my choices when it comes to how addictive or compulsive or just the compulsory nature of pornography. So I speak from a place of seeing the detrimental impacts it can have on one's life. I speak from a place of having gone through what it took to change that and make new decisions. And so now I've witnessed the positive of not having that in my life. So it's lived experience. It's also, I've met a lot of men who struggle with pornography and witnessing how their life was impacted by it. And then the men who have been able to come out of that hole, how their life was positively impacted.
It has no place.
No place, in my opinion. And that's
so what about the men that will say, I don't do it all the time. It's not that big of a deal.
This is a hill I'm willing to die on. I think that there will be a lot of men who try and cling to it. I've experienced that. I've made videos on porn before. I've seen other people make videos around pornography, and I've seen the plethora of men cling to their porn like it's the last thing they have on earth, and they will die on that hill. And it's just, why? What positive asset How does it bring value to your life? I would ask that question. I would say, what value does pornography bring to your life? How is it adding to you as a person? How is it strengthening your relationships? If you're single, how is it adding to your purpose on this earth? And I'm not going to judge anybody, but I just feel very strongly that it just, if you want a certain outcome in your life around productivity, um, feeling good about yourself, having a stable, truth-filled, honest, intimate relationship, has no place. If you don't want all those things, then have at it.
A lot of men will say that sex is a need. It's a need that they have. So if they are young, say 20s, single, they have these needs. The internet, pornography, access, easy. So what would you say to them as far as like, okay, well, sounds great, bro. Maybe they feel like you are, I mean, you are a very attractive male, 6'5", blue eyes kind of thing. Yeah, good job. Anyways, like stereotypical though, like you would attract maybe more opportunities as far as potential partners than other men would. What do you say to that? Like they have this need, there's access, it's easy, um, and they can't get their needs met maybe in relationship or they're rejected. What are they supposed to do?
I would say number one, the number one problem with that convenient story is you assume that all women desire a certain thing. I mean, there's men have a lot of stories around what women want, myself included. Historically, I thought that women wanted a lot of things that, after I worked on myself a lot, came out to just be stories.
Such as?
Well, stories like, yeah, you have to be 6'5", you have to be aesthetically built, you have to be, in my case, you had to be extremely developed physique wise. Like women want muscles and women want all these things. What I've experienced is the right person will be attracted to the right traits. Those traits being integrity, truth, comfort with self, comfort with being all of yourself. So many men walk around posturing, just displaying the things that, again, this is lived experience for me, displaying things that you think will get the thing or attract the woman. And so when I hear things like, well, it's easy for you, yeah, you could tell that story for the rest of your life and justify something that is deleterious to your mind and your body. I just think that's a convenient story to stay stagnant. I mean, it's like, okay, cool. If you run that play, if that's the play you choose, well, then for the rest of your life, you will be a victim to that story. I just think it's just a way to justify something that doesn't actually add any value to your life.
You said something about posturing, which I think is a very interesting phenomenon. And I think men do it, I think women do it as well. So I don't want to make it about men necessarily. But the thing that I have come to learn from my own experience is that when you try to be somebody that you think that you have to be, you don't always attract the person that you actually would want to be with. Right? It's kind of like you think you have to pursue a path, but you might end up at a destination you don't actually want to be at. And so, with your history, I'd be interested to understand, like, when you went through those things and you felt like you had to be a certain version of yourself, did that actually lead you to attracting the type of person that you would want to be with?
It was all smoke and mirrors. If you have to be anything other than yourself in order to elicit attention from someone or gain their commitment in a relationship, it's a house of cards, because eventually the real you will come out. And so I've experienced that, where my story was they wouldn't love the real me. They knew who I really was. I'm unlovable. So I did everything but be myself. I would contort myself. There's a contortion, right? And so that's where men will maybe listen and pick up on things that women say they're attracted to. Like, oh, I'm attracted to a really rugged guy. I'm attracted to a guy that's handy around the house. And a lot of men will contort themselves to be that, even if that's not who they really are. I have this story where in one of the relationships I was in, the person that I was with said that real men don't drink fruity drinks and they don't drink out of straws.
Mav loves fruity drinks, by the way.
Yeah, I love. I'm a mojito slut. But yeah, and so when I heard that, since wasn't comfortable with myself,
He started drinking whiskey.
yeah, I wasn't good with me, so I'd order old fashions and shit, and I fucking hated them, and I'd choke them down just to be that person's definition of what was manly, instead of just doing what I wanted to do. And a lot of people will criticize and like say, "Wow, bro, that's fucked up," and it's like, yeah, I did, and a lot of other people do it too. I'm comfortable with me now to where I can look back and laugh, but so many people are doing that. I think a lot of men are looking for the blueprint, the cheat sheet. Just tell me exactly what I need to do to attract the woman. Meanwhile, they don't even know what they want in a person or
So that was a
themselves.
question that I had for you. Is like, do you think that you ever went through a series of your life, and I can speak to women's, or at least my own experience that may apply to most women too, but like what you want not being what you need. Like thinking that you have to date a certain type of female to elicit your own status or reflection of your status to be able to date somebody of a certain quote unquote caliber. Do men, do you think, fall into that trap as far as like, you know, men will say they have to be 6'5", blue eyes, finance, whatever. But like also what are the women that they're trying to be with? What is the standard that they've set for them?
I think it's really interesting. There's actually a website out there. It's called the Women's Delusion Scale, where a lot of the things you just named, it's like, go ahead and input this information. What are your non-negotiables in a man? And like, it's like put their height, put their income, no criminal record, no kids, like all things you prefer.
Yeah.
And when you put in like let's just say 6 foot, over 6 feet, six
Mm-hmm.
figures, 6 inches, all these thing parameters that women like to. A lot of women, not all women, don't want to generalize, but a lot of women say it's like 0.6% of the population. So you have that on that side. With men, it's yeah. I mean, you depending on where you scroll on social media, you have another men's romance guru trying to tell how a real man should be. And I think young men are really impressionable to that. They'll hear that and immediately change personalities in the midst of that video.
But I mean, insofar as like the women that men feel like they have to be able to pull, right? So I'm trying to, maybe I'm not communicating this question well, but like women, for example, like you want somebody who's successful, good looking, attractive, fit. Um, there's a certain validation that you feel or that your peers will give you based on the partner that you have.
Yeah.
Do men experience the same thing? And if so, what is the perception of what type of woman a man should be with
Mm.
to be, again, I don't know if it's status or just seen in a certain way?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's linked to status. It's a lot of men will contort their person into a trophy. They will. It's like, well,
I've lived it.
I've chosen based on that criteria. And where did this criteria come from? It came from my upbringing. It came from the media. It came from what an alpha male was touted as in Hollywood and otherwise. And it was always this guy's got this bad bitch on his side. That was the words that were used, right? Like he's got this baddie with him. And
But
so
what
it's
is a
like
baddie?
baddie. Well, I think obviously there's some subjectivity there, but I think for the most part, it's somebody with a great body, with probably a quote unquote flawless face and great smile, just like these really general attributes that would be the stereotypical good looking woman. And so whatever that your flavor of that is in your culture, your family, your upbringing, that becomes what for me especially that I was programmed to seek it out because I was taught that that was what I should seek. But to your point earlier, it wasn't what I needed.
So men's proclivity to seek a partner is based on their beauty and aesthetics.
I think a good indicator is like for
I'm
me.
not saying the right answer. I mean like transparently in a man's mind, this is what they think they're and I think that's true. I think men are and value a woman's beauty.
Mhm.
I think that that is just a thing.
Yeah, you're
Women,
graded on it.
right, and for women, again, like one of the things women seek out, right, wrong, or indifferent, is a man's ability to provide. That's always going to be a part of the equation. Whether or not we want to admit it, it matters.
Mm-hmm.
And so like I don't want to paint a picture as far as like we'll get into kind of what we've learned and like the compromises that you're willing to make when it comes to finding what you need versus what your perception is of what you want, but I'm just talking about the perception. Right? If you grow up in a household, and again, like I love my mom, she's a superhero. Like she's incredible. But she always told me, don't fuck up your face. It's your best asset. Right? You'll be somewhat of a trophy wife. You want a man to take care of you. And even in the language around women seeking partners, or we can get into like divorce and some of the things that go around that, but it's always like you want a man who will provide for you. I think that's very common, a common understanding. Obviously, demographics have shifted a bit, but nevertheless, my, I guess my point being around we're talking about pornography, we're talking about men having sexual needs, we're talking about getting those needs met, we're talking about cultural pressure, societal pressure, and then the perception of the type of partner that you should be able to attract. going back into, like, I guess the concept of pornography in men's needs, if you cannot acquire the perceived partner in
Mhm.
which you should be able to, men tend to become resentful. And so when you're in that space, how do you come out of that?
Well, I think we have to look at historically, what people did before there was pornography to meet those needs. It's not like pornography is a natural part of, human psyche. This was introduced, within the past few decades. Like my parents didn't have that going. They had probably had magazines and stuff like that. There was different mediums for it, but the accessibility of instant online pornography didn't exist. So, how did people meet their needs back then? Well, there was a lot more human interaction. There was a lot more human interaction in general. I think that when we talk about self pleasure, it probably had a much different dynamic back then. There's a lot of different directions we can go. There's what is, if you have needs and you know the needs to be met, and you don't have a person to meet those needs, how do you meet those needs? Well, I think that those needs can be met, but it has become so normalized to seek out that kind of stimulus that people can't imagine not being without it, and they're getting exposed to it at younger and younger ages. And then what happens when you do it at such a young age, you start to associate the two together forever. So it's like I can't have masturbation without pornography. I have to have external stimuli in order to achieve this dopamine experience that my body is telling me I need. And so we have a generation, probably a couple generations at this point, of men and a lot of women as well, predominantly men, who the only way they know how to meet those needs and the way they were taught, the way they found it, whatever, was the combination of physical stimuli and the pornography stimuli. And that becomes their way of soothing or meeting that need for years and years and years until it becomes deleterious.
And you've lived that.
I have lived I've lived the extent of what that can do. Now, whenever I describe my journey, knowing how it has impacted other people, I kind of describe it as an elevator. And so the bottom floor would be someone who got so involved and so immersed that it gravitated to other things, potentially illegal things, things that could be harmful to others, things that could land them in a lot of trouble.
Like,
Well, a lot of people could get into, okay, so pornography is not enough anymore. You have reached the extent of that stimuli. Well, now I need something in person. So then maybe they gravitate to escorts. Maybe they gravitate to prostitution. Maybe they go to strip clubs. Maybe they go meet anonymously with people to satisfy needs. And then that becomes not enough. And then it just becomes more and more and more. And whenever you look at someone who's been, usually, I'm speaking very generally here, someone who's been, convicted of some kind of crime like that, it didn't just start out that way. There was a progression. And the gateway drug was usually pornography. So that's why I'm so serious about it, because I've seen how that progression happens and people don't realize where it starts. It doesn't start actually with pornography nowadays. It starts online with people like with Instagram accounts and YouTube videos, and that's where the stimulus can start, and you're exposed to it so often. That's why it's so important. I feel, again, I'm biased, my own experience, to curate your social media feed so you don't start that what could be a slippery slope into that.
so I want to talk about that because we talked a little bit about this previously in private, as far as like these platforms can be a gateway drug to something more extreme, and then it gets progressively worse, is probably a bad word, but like progressively more extreme.
Mm-hmm.
To the people that are like, it's not that big of a deal, women are always online in their bikinis or whatever, like, they don't see it as a big deal. It's like, it just is. It's just the way that social media is, and women are like that now. And women, we can talk about women later, but um, it seems to be a normal thing.
Mm-hmm.
And you are very adamant about like curating your stuff and keeping it PG.
Again, it depends on the outcome you want. In my opinion, if you're wanting to be family oriented and have true intimacy, and we have to distinguish between sexuality and intimacy, because I didn't know the difference for 2 decades, 3 decades almost. I didn't know the difference. I just started learning a few years ago. That difference was never made to me. So I lived a life conflating the two, thinking that sex was intimacy. Well, intimacy is connection, it's truth, it's someone knowing vulnerable truths about you and holding those and keeping those safe, being able to talk about those at length, being able to talk about anything with your partner, that begets the eroticism. You can't have intimacy and eroticism without that underlying truth and safety between two people. And that took me a long time to understand. Pornography takes away from all that. I think that what you said earlier, a lot of men think they need sex, but what they need is connection. I think that a lot of men are suffering because they don't have that connection. Because it's not actually, for a lot of people, sexual. It's just you want to connect with someone. And we live in a very isolating digital age where a lot of people aren't getting that connection. And that's when they go down that path of like, well, why would I put in the effort to go out and talk to a woman, dress up, try to impress, get in a conversation that's awkward, or go on the dating apps when I got porn right here? This porn doesn't, I don't have to impress it. It's always there and it always meets my needs or what they perceive their needs to be. So it's a big issue. And the person that is living that life will be in denial until it causes damage. And when it causes damage is an intimate relationship.
So I think one of the things I would like to hear your perspective on is I don't know how to ask this question politely. You have had a lot of experiences that were sexual in nature with other people prior to getting a better grasp of the difference between sex and intimacy. Because you don't know what you don't know throughout that period of your life, you you don't I don't know how to ask the question that I want to ask, but it's like it's very easy to justify continuing to do something. It feels good. You can say it's intimate. You go through the experience, you have the dopamine reaction or response, and you just live your life that way, not knowing differently. So the contrast in which you're trying to paint a picture around sex intimacy, for me, it's always come down to a value. But for men who have this story, and some of it I do believe is like biologically driven, so I don't want to say it's just a story that sex is a need. I do think men, on some level, require that. They're driven to be that way, right, wrong, or indifferent. What what are they missing around sex and intimacy? What is the difference, and why does it matter?
It's a great question. So, first off, I want to go back to the elevator analogy because I didn't finish it. I got off the elevator in my journey with sexuality pornography before it accelerated to something worse. Maybe it wouldn't have, but I got off the elevator nonetheless. A lot of people don't. And so that's the importance around this conversation. Now, to your question, it's empty. Hookup culture, using the dating apps, getting that validation that you think you need that makes you feel good, but it's just water through a pasta strainer. And it took me years to understand that it was just a hamster wheel that you never get off of because, number one, I didn't love myself. I think that the lack of self love and the lack of acceptance for myself led to me trying to feel good elsewhere and trying to fill that hole with other people. And it was never filled because nobody could give me that. I wasn't okay with myself. But as far as the justification for, promiscuity or one night stands or just, meaningless sexual encounters, you get to a point where it's just like, I don't feel good. This doesn't, at the end of the day, I'm still alone. I don't feel connected with anybody. Nobody understands me. I can't have a conversation that has any depth to it with anybody. This didn't make me feel whole or nourished or good about myself. And the fucked up part about it is the system drives itself because the lack of self love, the lack of self acceptance, you just keep doing the thing that makes you not like yourself, but you don't know any other way. So a lot of people just stay stuck in that.
Well, I see that more of like and to the same degree, I guess, different lens. It's like life tends to be a series of self fulfilling prophecies. So if you believe you are inadequate, unlovable, that there's something wrong with you, you're already have a proclivity to seek out things that will reinforce the belief that there's something wrong with you, that you are unlovable, and that nobody will do those things with you. Right? So it's like if I believe nobody will like me, let's just give a cleaner example. If I believe that nobody will like me, I have a way less likelihood to go out and engage in any type of social environment. If I don't ever go out and engage in a social environment or introduce myself or say hi to people or open up the opportunity to connect with people, I will reinforce a belief that nobody will like me. And so I'm creating the dynamic in which I say I don't want to exist. And that's the interesting paradox around a lot of the stories or beliefs that we carry is you will only go so far as what you actually believe, right? Because you don't step outside of those things. And so you have to have a lot of courage to seek out what is unknown or unfamiliar. To the same degree, like you speaking to having experiences that are very empty. At what point did that change? And why did it change? And like how, I think there may be people, I'm sure there are many people out there that have a very similar experience of like, I'm doing these things, I can get my needs met, and yet it's just another day at the office.
It takes awareness. I mean, people are at different levels of awareness with reality, with existential, everything, their values. I mean, I didn't even know what values were. I was so lost in the sauce that I was living two lives at one point. Like I was living the one life where I was trying to be the what I presented to be, which was fake for the most part. What I thought would make me attractive or likable, and then I had this other world where I was hypersexual or trying to meet my needs through pornography or otherwise, and meanwhile, really not liking myself. The thing that got me to change it was, I started going to therapy. Um, that started bringing more awareness to it because now I have a third party saying, "Hey, that's probably going to be really damaging long term. Let's think about where this came from." So I started mapping out in therapy sessions, started mapping out awareness of where this behavior came from because it wasn't making me feel good. I knew that. I knew two things. One, it wasn't making me feel good, and two, I was really struggling to stop doing it. So once someone started shining some light on this, it was scary because I was like, God, do I have a problem? Surely I don't have a problem. I was in denial for a long time, but as soon as I started accepting that I need help with this, is when I actually started to address it, and it took a long time. But I started in therapy, and then I started seeking out other modalities. I tried to quote unquote fix myself for a long time. I went to group therapy. I've had several, different kinds of therapists. I've done IFS work, and it was all beneficial in its own way. But I think turning points were identifying what I want out of life. Like, why am I here? What's the point? What do I want to be on this earth for? What is my purpose? And none of that had a place in my purpose. And none of that actually made me feel whole. When we talk about wholeness, there's people who try to meet those needs through what would be essentially processed food, which would be, in my opinion, hookup culture or, you know, interacting online with people or the dating app scene. There's a lot of processed food out there for people to gravitate to, like candy corn, and just grab it and then feel good in the moment because they're getting attention, maybe conflating attention with love, or what they're really looking for is connection, but it doesn't actually nourish you whatsoever. And so when I finally started experiencing nourishing interactions, primarily with you, and nourishing interactions from being present, like with my son, and doing things that bring me joy, guitar, shooting range, scuba, exercise, taking care of myself, I actually started liking myself, started to string together a lot of long periods of either abstinence or going without the thing that I hated myself for. This is over the course of years, but then I started to actually feel nourished. I started to actually feel whole. My life started to have meaning. I started to have purpose. I started to like myself, started to be proud of myself. And I couldn't have had any of that had I not gravitated away from those things. Those things in my life have no place. And so I just, yeah, I'm very adamant that if it distracts from intimacy with your person, if it if it's not real, if it's a fantasy, then why? It's just prolonging the inevitable of facing the damaging dynamic that it's creating.
One of the things that I've had to learn through life experiences is the concept of shattered assumptions. I think the only way in which you can do that, it's not necessarily seeking it out, but it can be, is you have to have a lived experience that deconstructs the story that you've created or the belief that you've lived out over a long period of time. In regard to this, for you personally, were there ever kind of life changing or perspective shifting lived experiences that reinforced or showed you differently that allowed you to take that step forward and stay in it? Because I think whenever we have a goal or perceived different version, right, there's the idea of it. And it sounds wonderful, right? Everybody wants to be better than they currently are. We all can be. However, there's limiting things around that as far as like what is possible. Is that even real? Am I being naive? Am I overestimating my current capabilities? Is that desired outcome actually real for me? Is it possible for me? And I think we all tend to be our own worst enemies. And so throughout my lifetime, when I've had limiting beliefs around certain things that I could do, there would always be some type of experience, a person that would come in, somebody would speak belief into me, an opportunity would show up for me, like just some type of actual thing rooted in reality that would give me the permission slip that I needed to take the step that I wanted to take. I share all that to ask you the question, has that happened for you? Right? Because I feel as though many people will justify just kind of like people who emotionally eat or have dessert every day. It's like there's not too many terrible consequences. I wake up and I'm still here. It's not like I'm in a hospital bed or there's some catastrophic thing. So you can justify doing it. People that overeat on the weekends and then go back on track and their weight stabilizes by Thursday before they go on a bender Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And so because there's no deleterious impact acutely, you can tell yourself and justify why that's okay to continue to live in that cycle.
Well, I had a little bit of both. I had some very damaging outcomes of my behavior. It ripped up relationships. It robbed me of sovereignty. It continuously created negative outcomes in my life. So I had the negative consequences front and center. But as far as unraveling the beliefs and seeing proof that what I was doing was fruitful, I did this shit on hard mode. And what I mean by that is, I know I'm not the only one, but I lacked any community here. I lacked any community support. I have had very, very little support in general as I've been trying to change myself and show up differently. And so I didn't have any feedback other than like maybe a mentor I was working with or a coach here and there that I may let in on a little bit. But for the most part, I had to just have blind faith. I knew that I didn't like where I was at. I knew that much. These, I was driven almost to the brink of taking my own life. So I had been to the worst. I'd been to the bottom, I guess, in my own way. And the unraveling the beliefs was the compounding interest of showing up differently, the confidence in myself, my ability to be productive, the fruits of that labor. I mean, there's tangible fruits, like obviously if you're not distracted or caught up in some kind of compulsion, you're going to make more money because you have more energy to put towards creating money. I started liking myself more. I was more confident. I attracted higher caliber people into my life, whether it was people I came into contact with. I wouldn't have attracted you had I been in an unhealthy place. Um, so there were outcomes, I guess, that showed me proof, but I had to do a lot of it without proof. I had to do a lot of it knowing that I had to do all of it, not knowing that I would get a return on that investment. All I knew was I didn't like who I was, and I wanted to show up differently.
As you went through that, a lot of people will struggle with hiccups and hurdles of past behavior showing up.
Which I did.
How did you move through that?
That's the hardest part. That's the hardest part because I know we're talking particularly about pornography and the impact that can have, but take anything, any maladaptive coping mechanism. Very few people just stop overnight. I know people wish they could, but your body, your nervous system, your hormones, your serotonin levels, your dopamine, all of it takes time to regulate. And what you've done to make yourself feel better in times of stress or overwhelm or sadness or relationship strife, what have you, to help yourself feel better, if you've been doing that for years and it's the only way you've known to soothe, it doesn't go away overnight. So, naturally, yeah, I wasn't perfect. And there were a lot of times that I got hopeless because of it. I almost, like in the beginning, especially, I would have like a lot of super, super highs, thinking I'd figured it out, and then huge lows, depression. I would go off the grid for 3 days recovering because I thought, because it almost became a cycle of you do the thing you hate, makes you hate yourself. Now you feel like shit, so you do the thing again to escape that feeling. Then you hate yourself again. You know, a lot of people get in that cycle. But I also had echo chambers at that time that were convincing me that it was incurable, like a disease. Whether you've done AA or what have you, and no shade to those types of modalities. If it helps you, great. I'm just a believer that self identity is really important. If you're identifying as a quote unquote addict or someone who is diseased and incurable, well, that's not going to really help you show up differently, in my opinion. There's a lot of root work there to be done. But I was in echo chambers that were reinforcing the belief that this is something that it was something I was always going to be. It's part of my psyche, and it would never go away. And that wasn't helpful for me. I had to get out of that environment in order to make real change, and that was a courageous step as well, because you get convinced that you can't leave, and that if you do, you're going to succumb to this disease, quote unquote. But that wasn't the case. The way I moved through that got better and better over time. The biggest factor was compassion, grace, patience, because there's two ways you can deal with it. It's like, one, you can kick yourself in the nuts over and over and scorn yourself and beat yourself up, which doesn't help at all. Or you can have compassion, you can have grace, you can have love. Many times I had to look in the mirror and say, I got you. Like, here we are again. I still love you. I got you. Keep going. I had to talk to myself because I was the only person that had my back at that time. So I chose to do it on hard mode. I didn't have a lot of support. I did a lot of it alone. Um, but the ingredient there that helped me move through when I would mess up or slip up or do the thing I was trying not to do, it was just, hey, I love you anyway. Still here. I love you anyway. I'm still here. I'll never forget that. I had many times where I'd be sitting there looking at myself in the mirror, and I'd be like, I got you. Like, we're still here. And I always say the hand that pulled me out of the hole was attached to my own arm.
Mm.
I had to love me.
That's I think that that's really beautiful. I also find it to be incredibly difficult. We've talked about my story, and the only way that I can convey that differently is not in the same struggle, but the same type of self inflicted suffering to a certain degree. And then you have to decide that you're meant for more and you deserve more, and then have the courage to let yourself do things differently, even if it's on shaky ground. As you've now, obviously, we're talking, the perspective on that isn't like it was yesterday. This is years ago for you ish. What How do you feel about your life now in comparison? And
Dude.
if somebody's in the same hole that maybe you're talking about and they feel really seen or understood, or just like, fuck man, like, that makes sense to me. What is the contrast of you walking away from some of those things or being able to do that?
Well, that's the other reason why I'm so convicted around this, is because the life I have now I didn't think was possible in those moments. I got convinced by people who needed me to stay that person to prolong a story they had about me, and I had to courageously keep pursuing change. And if I could tell, if I could go back in time and tell myself one thing, it'd be like, man, just don't fucking quit. Keep going, because life rips at the end of this. I'm just, yeah. Sometimes it's surreal. It's surreal for me to both the life that I have and the person that I am, to be proud of who I am. I didn't have that ever, and that reinforces the life that you're living. Once you get to that point, not like there's a summit. It's a forever journey of all. We all want to grow. We all want to show up differently and do our best and evolve. But once you're at that point where you're proud of yourself, it solidifies where you're at to the point where you can't even conceptualize going back to living a life without that integrity. Like, once I had that integrity, once I finally got there where it was like everything I am on camera and portraying to you and portraying everywhere else as a dad, like, that's who I actually am. Once you get to that point, that is a strength that nobody can take from you. And it makes you immune to, I don't want to say that criticism doesn't impact me, but like people tell a story about me online or say negative shit, and I know who I am, and you really have that, which I really admire about you, which has also helped me a lot with it. But life is incredible. I feel elevated emotions that I really were very scarce years ago, such as joy, gratitude. You hear me all the time. Tell you how grateful I am for our relationship, for everything that we have, because I know what it's like to not have integrity, to be a shade of myself, just portraying a facade that I want everyone because I want everyone so badly to like me or approve of me. I know what it's like to not be able to look someone in the eye and have a conversation, male or female. So it's almost like it's almost surreal how good life actually gets when you are able to show up differently. When you do the things that are really painful short term, very painful, like owning that I had a problem and owning that I, you know, had a fucked up worldview, and like that was hard. Like I didn't. It makes you feel broken. It makes you feel flawed, like you're a mistake or that you're a piece of shit. But on the other side of all that, when I got through, when I took responsibility and I continued to show up and continued to take responsibility in my own outcomes and just compounded, and then one day you wake up and you're like, holy shit, like I didn't think this was possible.
I think one of the things that's really important for anybody who might feel the same way that you just discussed is like every behavior that you have is learned. Every association with the opposite sex, yourself, relationships, health, fitness, drugs, alcohol, whatever, you got that idea from somewhere, right? And somebody, whether it was something you observed, something you heard, something you watched, um, I think especially men, they have this pressure to be dominant, right? And kind of prove their prove their status significance, whatever you want to call it, through the ability of kind of this is going to sound terrible because I can't think of another way to say this, but like having bodies in
Mm-hmm.
your back pocket. That's kind of like a status symbol for men. And so you have this pressure to do that, pairing that with some of your own maybe disconnections between who you actually are and who you feel like you need to be. And then you get into the space of feeling like you have to prove yourself in order to be enough in that domain of your life with some of your history. I can see how that comes to fruition. I think that sex is a really big thing, obviously, for women. I think, yes, but more so around the idea of like being attractive as far as like somebody that men would pursue or somebody that men want or desire. Um, but I think men's dominance is highly associated with their ability to pull women, and that becomes this like gaming experience.
Gaming, yeah. I think it's like okay, it's two things. One, who are you when everything that feeds your ego is taken away?
Mm-hmm.
What's left? Who are you? I think that's a really poignant question I had to ask myself. Like, you took away the social media, the body, the my perceived success. Who am I? What's left? And that was really pivotal for me to start addressing that. Who am I really?
Well, and I think one of the things early on that in our relationship that was very interesting to me is you obviously had experiences. My whole, I guess, where I started with this was to come to this point. You had this perception that people aren't who they say they are, right? And so we had a really great friendship, a really great connection, a lot of deep conversations. But there was a part of you that didn't believe I was who I said I was. And I think that also gave you leeway in a troubling moment to not lead yourself in a manner that, or keep a door open for you, potentially. And then in a moment where, for me, like your frame of reference around that is different than mine. And so, like, I can see how you came to a conclusion where that enabled some things that caused distress at a point. But for me, it was like I couldn't see that because my perspective is different around those different things. And then you can, like I said earlier, kind of alluding to shattering assumptions. But from that point on, I feel as though you've never really looked back or questioned me, and it also allowed you to not question you, which I think is really important as far as like life being a series of projections and mirrors.
I think that it's been a key. I don't know if you call it a North Star or just a feature or a guiding light. I don't know, but us from that point on, back in June, I've had zero question about you or me. So it was super impactful. I driving that point home of you are who you say you are. I'd never met anyone like you who had such strong values to stand on and actually practice what everybody was just up to that point. I'm not, well, I want to speak very generally. My experience in life was people who, friends or otherwise, just they say what they want, that what they need to. They say whatever they need to get you bought in, and then it's not really that, you know. Um, you're not that person, and that inspired to be that person for me. Like that inspired me to step into that because that's who I am too. I just didn't have any trust or safety to be that. And obviously a lot of prerequisite work before we met, but I'm just grateful. I'm grateful that that's never a question for us. And yeah, it brought a lot of integrity into the picture, and it allowed me to step into myself a lot more.
Well, what I think is really important around that, just conceptually, again, is painting the contrast of like, you don't know what you don't know, right? So if everybody around you is putting on a mask to kind of approach a certain situation in order to gain a certain outcome, right? Then you're always curating yourself like you're on a mission for achieving something. And so I'll remember that day very, very much so, but it was like one of those moments where I could truly understand, and this is why like we moved through that so effectively. It was like I could see, even though I'm not justifying it, I could see from your lens how you could have such a perspective or perception that would move you into that. Whereas for me, my entire life, my form of function, this is why I have rules, this is why I do things the way that I do them. It's because like I know in what containers I feel the best about myself. And I went through a period different than you, but like 8 years of just solitude where like I had to figure myself out and I had to figure out what it was that I wanted and where I was going and what I valued and who I was without all the things that feed your ego, as you would say. And so I think like the beautiful thing about you and our relationship and the things that I'm most honored about is like I feel like I've genuinely gotten to know you, and I think you're wonderful. And I've always said that from the very beginning, from when I first met you. I've always said I don't want you to be anything but what you are, and I think that you're fucking wonderful because you are. But I also like my heart breaks for people that feel like they're not enough, and this is kind of like the pot calling the kettle black because I feel that way about myself very often, right? But I think it's hard to see yourself objectively, and it's also you're only ever going to excel to the level in which you perceive you can get to. And so this is why having people around you I think is so important. And I'm very intentional about who I communicate with and what we talk about because just like you mentioned echo chambers earlier, like some people are dead weight and they will be dead weight. Right? People never want to see you doing better than themselves. I hate that quote, but it's relatively true. And so you have to want better for yourself even not knowing if you can actually get there. And I think once you give yourself permission to at least try while accepting your own levels of humanity, that's kind of the adventure of your life. And it just gets exciting, even if you fuck it up, because you will. But watching you become who you are over the last, was it 6 months now? I think it's beautiful. And I've grown just as much. Like I wouldn't have grown in ways around me and even relative to this concept if I hadn't met you. Like there are certain things that you just don't know until you experience them. and it can completely shatter certain beliefs that you carry. And so while I'll always say that our wounds are similar, though the source is different, but I think we've both grown in the domain of intimacy for sure, reflective of one another throughout that.
Definitely reciprocal growth. A lot of reward, a lot of purpose. If we could pivot back into porn real quick, I wanted to hit on something.
Smut books?
No, not smut books. We'll get to that.
Okay.
So our intimate life is badass, and
Oh,
the reason
God.
no wait listen.
Give me a drink.
Caffeine, okay. But I want to talk about
Tequila.
why that is, right? Not in detail, but I want to talk about what contributes to a truly intimate, connective, deep experience there. A lot of it is because there's no outside stimulus. It's something that we didn't hit on early on, but there's no, I feel like in a lot of relationships and marriages, like let's just say that the sex or whatever starts to wane, right? The flame starts to wane, or like starts to get mediocre, or someone's not getting their needs met, what have you. Well, then a lot of people's knee-jerk reaction to that will be to go and seek stimulus elsewhere, and they'll say,
I think that's a guy thing. You think that's a girl thing too?
absolutely,
This
it's
is
where
where
smut
like
books come in.
I feel like my perception of women, I mean my comment section will tell you this, but like I am just flabbergasted by some of the shit women do that I like didn't think.
Oh yeah, but just speaking to seeking stimulus elsewhere, I will say it's predominantly men. I'm not saying it's only men, but it's predominantly men. And so, and again, I can only speak from my life experience as well. So just talking about porn. The more outside stimulus you get outside of the
Well, it's
container,
not just porn though.
I'm gonna get there.
Okay, well you said porn, and then I'm like, well,
I'll get there. So, but just using porn we'll just use porn as an example for now. If you have outside stimulus, it's going to take away from what should be your main source of stimulus, which is your partner. Now, obviously, compatibility comes into focus. All these things, mutual desires, and a lot of this needs to be talked about.
it's not a
Before.
given.
It's not. It's not a given. 100%.
That's one of your favorite things to
It's not.
say.
No, it's true. It's not a given.
I've never heard that so much in my life until
But
you said it a million times.
my point is that the more outside stimulation you're getting, the less. Number one, it will deteriorate the integrity of your sexual relationship with your partner eventually, no matter what. And a good indicator of this is if a person's honest about it or not. Like, hey, do you watch porn? No, I don't watch porn. No. And then you look at the browser history. I had this happen one time. I was friends with a married couple. I was friends with the guy, and he was showing me something on his phone one time, and he went to type in Google. It showed like his last 10 searches. It was like Pornhub, Xvideo, like all these porn sites, right? And so later on, I brought it up. I was like, hey, I noticed, you had this and that. I was like, you watch, because I was curious from my own experience, like, how often do you do that? He's like, no, I don't really, I just really went into like a macho bravado type of denial place, which is a key indicator that you're ashamed of this, and the shame is probably impacting your relationship with your partner at some point. We didn't get into that, but I knew it from experience. So that being said, I know what you were trying to lead me to, which is where does the stimulus start? Because it's not just porn, right? Porn is like the end outcome of trying to get that need met. But in my opinion, and this is going to be polarizing, and we kind of alluded to it earlier, it starts on these social media platforms and elsewhere. It starts with what are yours, because you have all these behaviors at the surface, we'll say, that if left unchecked will just gravitate and progress to the ultimate thing, which is the inevitable, the pornography, right? But like for example,
Is pornography the end game? Because I feel like it still extrapolates to like actual physical infidelity.
it can, sure, it's like it can be a gateway drug, but a lot of people stay on porn for a long time, and then the progression depends on the frequency, the a lot of things. It's like there's a lot of psychological factors that play here. There's how do you soothe otherwise? Like what the more it becomes the go-to method of soothing, the more it will progress to other things because the increased stimulation and exposure to this.
We've talked about taboo
Yeah.
and like the what is the word I'm looking for? Almost like the desire to pursue something that is more taboo.
Yeah, you have your mapping that you're kind of born with, and everybody has their own particular mapping when it comes to sexuality. But as far as what you are drawn to, progress to, it's because regular. Okay, so just to give a very specific example, everybody starts with like plain Jane missionary pornography, right? Like just male, female, vanilla, just like not really hardcore. Like the average boy's journey for me started on like Cinemax late night, where they don't show full on, intercourse. It's just like boobs and that's it, right? Well, then you get curious and you're like, well, I want to see more, and then you find internet porn. It shows everything. Well, the person that gets really, really desensitized to that because of the overexposure and the frequency will then say, well, this isn't really getting the job done anymore. I'm not as aroused because your dopamine has become accustomed to it. Let me find something a little more different, something that ignites the flame in my brain because this plain Jane stuff doesn't do it anymore. So then you start searching for other stuff. Where that goes is dependent on the person, but the pornography sites cater to this. They have an algorithm where they show you something slightly more extreme. Oh, you like this? Well, maybe you'll like this. And it's like, then you get into this thing where you've spent hours searching for the perfect video because nothing really does it. Nothing really does it anymore. And you get to a point where no pornography does anything. So then that's where you have people who will gravitate to other people, or like I said earlier, like things like escorts or things in person, because the digital stuff doesn't do anymore. It's a progression based on a desensitization, and that is the danger if left unchecked.
Yeah, that sounds horrifying.
Mm-hmm. Happens every day. It's an epidemic. Nobody wants to talk about it. People want to normalize it. I'll never be in that camp. I think there's no place for it. I think that this whole idea of like sex workers are, like they deserve to be. No, no, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with it. I think OnlyFans and stuff like that changed the dynamic as well. Now you've got people who can participate, and it fast tracks it even more. They want to accelerate they want to accelerate how fast they can get you addicted, and in some kind of subscription service or what have you.
And I just think, again, like for me, the idea that I should sell my body publicly is more degrading than most things. I think I'd rather work at McDonald's. I just, I think that women set the standard for what men will do, and women want to talk about how there are no good men anymore. I hear that often. There are no good men. Well, men don't have to work very hard to get their needs met anymore, and we voluntarily engage in that, right? Men wouldn't watch porn if women weren't in front of a camera. Men wouldn't be subscribing to OnlyFans if women weren't in front of a camera. And so you put yourself there, and then you wonder where all the good men are. It's like they don't have to work very hard to get fucked. It's just like, excuse my language, but like, that's where I do think that women set the standard for what men do. If you go way back before we had the internet and stuff, like, men really had to pursue women, and they had to be old-fashioned, if you will, and ask for their parents' approval, and knock on the door and drop them off, and call them, not texting, sending letters. Like, you just think about the amount of effort that men had to put forward towards women historically, and how little effort it is right now to send a random message on fucking Tinder if you want to come over at 1 a.m. It's like, of course, the entire market is. I don't think we have self-respect. And if you don't have self-respect, you don't have respect for another person. How could you? So for me, like, this whole conversation, obviously I don't have the background that you do with sex at all. Mine's quite the opposite. But I think it makes the conversation really difficult to have, because my goal is not to offend anybody or say that your values are wrong. But what I am saying is, if you're, and you can speak to men, but if you're a female who's dissatisfied with the way that men treat you, maybe you should look at the standards that you embody for yourself. Because if you put yourself out there like you're a piece of ass, you will be treated like a piece of ass. And I don't know how else to say that nicely.
I think a lot of it also, that's a great, very well said. Very well said, first of all. They would also talk about, again, speaking from the male lens, the ability for one to delay what feels good now for what is best forever. And a lot of that has to do with saying no to people.
Well, I think that's the like. There's a book I've already outlined, but the title of it is No, and I wanted to write it for my daughter because I think that women, because we're much more agreeable, and I'll always talk about personality dimensions, but like women don't like conflict, and we also most women, based on my understanding of women, because I will acknowledge that like my perception is off kilter relative to current society, obviously, but women, especially when I was growing up, the only girls that I knew that would sleep with boys or would sleep with the guys that they were trying to date or like whatever it was, because they wanted them to commit. Women like to play this game where we're just like men and we can just fuck and it's like meaningless and it's just fun. And it's like, no. Like, I'm sorry, but no. Like, most people are like, yeah, I fucked him. And they'll say that to another girl who they know he's talking to just so that she can like be like, no, I'm sleeping with him. Like, even though he's not committed to her. It's like one of those things where women think if they sleep with a guy, they can get them to like them. But that's not how it works. I knew that very early on, just because my brother was like my best friend and I played sports. So I'd hear how guys would talk about women. And my number one thing, I remember being in middle school, just being like, I never want somebody to talk about me that way. I never want to be one of those girls. I was embarrassed for them. And it sucks. And they were embarrassed for themselves because you're just the talk of the locker room. And then you can tell yourself that that feeds your ego or whatever. But
I think at some point you just want a richer life. You want a richness of the experience of life. If you do. For me, that was a big driving force. It's like, I want to feel more than this. There's got to be more to life than this.
well, there's something around exclusivity, right, wrong, or indifferent.
Well, yeah, that's a prerequisite for the richness and the depth.
One thing that my dad told me is that every single time you engage in that with somebody, they take a part of you. Right? So, like, I remember when he told me that, and I was just like, yeah, I don't like the idea. Because and I don't need to make this about me at all, but like, I've had experiences where I didn't want to engage in those types of activities, if you will. And so, like, that can make you feel like somebody stole your innocence. So, for me, it was like an overcorrection as far as like, I want nothing to do with any of that. I do think that there's something for me around my perception and values as far as a woman's job for herself is to protect her innocence, right? And I think that a man's job is to make sure that he can protect you, but also getting worldly experience, right? Men tend to lead. I think that that's true. I'm not saying that double standard is good or bad. Based on my perception and values, I'd say that that's right. But yeah, there's many things as far as like the concept of saying no, being able to disappoint people, being able to take lash back when men are like, don't you fucking know who I am? Do you know how many women would kill to be in your position? It's like, okay. But a lot of women can't do that. And I don't know if it's the same for men on the other side of that, but I think that just learning to say no and being okay with disappointing people, people not liking you, people thinking that I was told I was prude growing up. I was so prude because I'd say no, and wasn't my nature. I wasn't ready. And, you can judge yourself for that, especially if that's what people say about you, but I'm grateful that I stuck to it because I don't know. Again, I have a lot of female friends who did things differently, and I heard a lot of stories, and a lot of them are cool with it too. Like, I'm not saying you should feel shame if that for you as a woman is like the thing for you and you're empowered by it. Like, okay, that's awesome. Own your sexuality, I guess. But I just knew the texture of my own mind would not allow me to feel positive about myself engaging in that without meaning underneath it, because my natural proclivity psychologically and emotionally is always to ask what everything means, which can drive you nuts, but it's just the way that my brain works.
No, I love your brain. Do you have any more questions?
I think it's really difficult to conceptualize doing that on your own. I think you mentioned that you did it the hard way. I think for the men that I have worked with and the ones that, and you kind of fit into this, it's like you on the outside would have looked like you had everything together, Like, even when I first met you, I would have never guessed that you had a struggle such as what we've discussed today, right? The perception of you is that you are attractive, successful, confident, audacious, um, and yet you had like an inner struggle. How how do you move through that? Like, even your content has shifted pretty radically. But as far as the perception versus the actual lived experience, how did you move through the disconnect there? And then for people that need support or want support, it's like I don't know how you made it through that without it.
It's tough. You asking like how I showed up on social media despite having these horrible struggles?
Not just that, but what weight did that carry in your mind? Right? The integrity gap, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's some acceptance that I couldn't close that gap overnight. It's going to take a long, prolonged effort. But I needed. There were parts of me that were very much me, and that was the goofy parts, the audacious parts, the comedic parts. Those parts could thrive on social media because funny always works. I was good at something, which was helping people get healthier. I could convey that in a comedic way. And so what it's kind of like take any stand-up comedian who like Robin Williams for example or you know a lot of them are depressed in their personal lives. But they find a lot of I guess reprieve from that or escape in making people laugh. And so for me, I lived the life of a stand-up comedian online for a long time. And I also, you said, my content has shifted quite radically. Yes, it has. I also had to work through a belief that I had to be loud and super audacious and usually shirtless online in order to elicit the attention that would help me build a career. And it took a lot of doing the opposite and then seeing a positive outcome for me to unravel that belief, and that was very peaceful for me to know that I didn't have to do those things in order to be respected.
I have a very uncomfortable question to ask you.
All right.
Your social media, you have a large following across platforms, within platforms and across platforms. The majority of those are women. Did that ever lead you to a place where you felt validated and or again because I do know men who will leverage their female following for opportunities. Have you ever been in that space? Did you ever justify that type of thought pattern or behavior, or like did it make you feel again like a status symbol as far as like, yeah, I am this guy that has this many followers and these many women and those types of experiences?
I think in the early stages, especially, I was trying to make amends with myself by helping as many women as possible. I was like, well, if I help as many women as possible, that will help me feel better about my infidelity or not being integral. It's like, well, but I have this evidence here. Look, these women love me. These women are praising me for helping them. Obviously, I'm not a bad guy. Obviously, that wasn't enough for me to have integrity in my life, but I think it was part of me that was trying to make amends. It was part of me that was trying to prove that I wasn't a bad guy. I was good at it. Um, so yeah, there was definitely some validation there. I'm really glad that shifted, and a lot of that shift had to do with who am I really?
Mm.
Um, why am I doing what I'm doing really? I had to ask myself these questions like, am I doing this because it's a high, or am I doing this because it's genuinely what I love to do? And that's when you can kind of see my content shift. It's if you scroll down, it's pretty. It's like a de-evolution of self, pretty much. But the information's always been sound, but the presentation has changed over time as I got more comfortable with myself and accepted myself more. But yeah, I would say definitely in the early stages, it was like, well, I can't be that because I'm this. I have my online life that's validating that I'm good at something and I'm such a helpful and I'm useful and I have utility here and it was an escape in some ways.
A lot of people, not a lot of people, that's probably a false claim. I think that there are people, I know there are people, who will leverage I don't know how to ask this question. So we've talked about dating apps, we talked about pornography, we talked about ease of access, we talked about optionality. When you have a larger platform, you are perceived as being, again, higher status. And there are groups of both genders who will do the sliding in the DM isms. I know men, not you. I know men who would leverage that as a means of like getting their needs met because there's just options in their DMs every day. Did you ever get into a space where as your audience grew, those types of things happened? And how did you, because a lot of them justify that. They're like, I am this guy. I have all these women. I can do whatever I want, whenever I want. The drop of a hand, whether it's, again, it doesn't necessarily mean they meet them in person, but like there's always some type of entertainment for them.
Yeah, I'd say at my worst, it definitely made it easier to have access to those types of conversations and interactions. I will say that the perception has seemed to be that I'm just like people lined up at my door. That's never been the case. I've never had flooded DMs with people in them, and I think a lot of that has to do with because everybody thinks that they are, so therefore nobody actually gets in them. But I will say, yeah, there were parts, especially early on years ago, where it made it really easy. I didn't have to really work hard to have interactions with people if I didn't want to. I mean, it was always there, and the platform definitely gave me a little bit of a perceived notoriety or something because of the follower number. But you know, that wasn't fulfilling whatsoever. But that was definitely, I think it existed early on. Yeah.
And how did you shift away from that? Right? Because I think a lot of people just like watching porn regularly. I think that people can get stuck in that.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't bringing positive outcomes to my life. Um, it wasn't who I wanted to be. I always felt a lot of shame after interacting with strangers online, whether it gravitated to something sexual or not. Um, and so I took measures to no longer do that. I had to set boundaries. I had to say no. And then, you know, when my content started to shift more, a lot of that dissipated, and it didn't really attract that type of attention. Um, so it's not something that I'm now with how my life is. It's set up in a way where it's not something that I would ever be interested in or what have you. I've made enough neuroplasticity to this point where that's not appealing. But there was a point in time where it was very difficult to resist because it was low hanging fruit.
Hmm. Pause. The mics are on still. I don't know what else to ask.
I don't know what else you could ask at this point.
I feel like we've tackled it all.
Mm-hmm. Hope this was helpful for you guys.
No, Mav, thank you for talking about it because I know it's not a comfortable conversation to have at all. I appreciate you.
Hopefully it's helpful.
I think it will be. I think we didn't even get into smut books, but just know that it's just as...
Smut books or pornography for women. Come at me.
Yeah, I think that there's the hedonistic treadmill, as we've talked about before. Ease of access to what feels good in the short term versus what you want most in the long term. But thank you for your vulnerability, openness, opinions, hard stances, and storytelling.
Happy to be of service.
Okay, bye. You don't turn your mic on. Thank you for talking about it because I know it's not a comfortable conversation to have at all. I appreciate you.
Hopefully it's helpful.
I think it will be. I think we didn't even get into smut books, but just know that it's just as...
Smut books or pornography for women. Come at me.
Yeah, I think that there's the hedonistic treadmill, as we've talked about before. ease of access to what feels good in the short term versus what you want most in the long term. But thank you for your vulnerability, openness, opinions, hard stances, and storytelling.
Happy to be of service.
Okay, bye.